Hey there. Welcome to our presentation on Hurricane Juan's destruction and decades of regrowth at Point Pleasant Park, also known as Amntu'kati. Let's get into this. It's important for us to actually understand what it is that we're looking for in this lab and to recognize the variables. We're focusing on the area disturbed by a hurricane, which in this case, it removes the tree canopy cover and disturbs the understory vegetation. And then with succession, so it leads to secondary succession. Succession is divided into two parts. We have primary, which refers to the geologic changes of existing substrate or the creation of entirely new substrate. And secondary, again, which is what we see here, it is succession that involves disturbances that do not create, recover, remove new substrate. So we're just changing the existing substrate. Local context. Hurricane Juan made landfall on September 29th, 2003 as a Category 2 hurricane, destroying much of Point Pleasant Park with an estimated 70% loss of the park's canopy cover. Point Pleasant Park lies within Kichipaduk, known as Amntu'kati, holding cultural significance as a gathering place. It is also an urban park. Biodiversity-wise, it's a mixed Acadian forest type dominated by mature softwood prior to 2003. This was predominantly red spruce and white pine, followed by hardwoods such as red maple, white birch, and red oak.
Okay, so our objectives are to understand the effects of Hurricane Juan on Point Pleasant Park and how secondary succession has progressed by looking at data collected from 6 different sites in the park from 2004 to 2005. We also want to determine how the overall community has changed, how the density of the dominant species in 2004 and 2005 have changed, and how the chosen community metric has changed over time following the disturbance. Finally, we want to predict what will happen to these variables as the forest moves towards its climax community. Our hypotheses are that the diversity of the community will have increased, red spruce will gradually replace red maple as the dominant species, and that the diversity will decrease as the forest approaches its climax community.
Now on to our methods. So for our methods within lab, groups were assigned to 6 sites in the most damaged areas of Point Pleasant Park. For us, it was Site 2. Random quadrants were then selected for sampling just by throwing an object and picking where it landed. Half of the group measured tree diversity and growth via trunk circumference. The other half sampled a 50 by 50 centimeter area for vegetation and abiotic cover. Species and percent cover were then recorded, and data from all groups were combined before using Shannon-Weiner index known as H and Pelo's evenness index known as J to generate linear regressions and statistical analysis for the graphs in this presentation.
Okay, to start off our results and discussion, we're going to be looking at the changes in the overall forest community as Point Pleasant Park recovers from the Hurricane Juan disturbance using Shannon's diversity, which is an index that incorporates both species richness and evenness into its measure of diversity. It's also known as H prime. So our results show that from 2004 to 2005, H prime increased from approximately 0.5 to 1.5, showing a 200% increase in overall community diversity. This supports our hypothesis and is consistent with findings that species diversity increases following a disturbance as more resources become available, creating greater ecosystem heterogeneity as more species establish. So we predict that as this secondary succession in Point Pleasant Park continues, the species diversity will continue to increase, but its rate will slow or decline as the forest moves towards its climax community. This is because the competition may eliminate species that initially colonized the area. For example, Pratch et al. 2021 found that forest diversity peaked after 40 years of succession and then it declined before rising again.
So we were interested in how the dominant species density has changed over time. In 2004, Point Pleasant Park was in its early succession stage. Pioneer and early successional hardwoods like the red maple and birch just started establishing. And the red maple establishes really quickly in post-disturbance conditions when there's an abundance of light and canopy space. We see that the density of the red maple is much higher in 2025 and is still increasing, which in additional to the continual rise in diversity, tells us that we're not quite in the late successional stage. The red spruce density has gradually increased over time because it is a late successional shade-tolerant species that reestablishes in the understory. And because of all of this, we predict that the red spruce will likely continue to grow in density and become the dominant species in the future as the late successional climax species. Okay, so here we're looking at the density trends of red maple and red spruces and how they've changed in Point Pleasant Park from 2004 to 2025. And these trends directly relate to our hypothesis that the forest is currently in mid-succession, dominated by red maple, with red spruce slowly increasing as the conditions shift towards late successional Acadian forest. So the red maple, which you can see on the left, has a positive and relatively steep slope, meaning its density increased quickly following Hurricane Juan. And this fits with the ecological expectations. The storm opened up the canopy, it created highlight conditions that the red maple thrives in, and as an early to mid-successional species, it grows rapidly and takes advantage of the disturbance, really at all. The p-value is highly significant, so this upward trend is real, while the low r squared shows that although the trend is present, it is somewhat variable through time. And on the right, you can see we have the red spruce. So this is showing a positive slope, but it's much shallower. And this indicates that the red spruce is recovering, but at a much slower and more gradual rate. And this also makes sense because it is a shade-tolerant late successional species that does not dominate immediately after disturbances. Instead, the red spruce reestablishes gradually in the understory, and it becomes more abundant as the canopy closes. And its p-value is also significant, although a low r-squared reflects a weaker, more scattered trend. And altogether, these patterns match what we predicted, that the red maple shows a rapid early increase, typical of mid-successional hardwoods, while the red spruce increases slowly, consistent with its role as a late successional conifer. This suggests that red maple is current dominance is temporary, and over the long term, as the shade levels continue to rise, the red spruce is expected to gradually replace the red maple in the canopy, moving Point Pleasant Park back towards a mature Acadian forest structure similar to the pre-disturbance conditions. Changes in community metrics have changed over time, seen throughout early, mid, and predicted late successional growth. Early on, it was barren with a clean slate for secondary succession following Hurricane Juan. Mid-succession, which is what we're currently seeing, shows the vegetation recovery with decreasing evenness as red maple becomes increasingly dominant. Red spruce is still increasing, but is obviously less abundant. The predicted outcomes within late succession is a decrease in diversity and a lower species evenness as a red maple and pine will likely dominate as it approaches the climax community. We just have a graph to better explain and visualize the data, which was in the previous slide. This shows the linear path of richness increasing with a decrease in evenness. The odd dips are likely due to smaller scale disturbances such as droughts, which we had over the summer, and human activity. Conclusion. Okay, so in conclusion, overall, Point Pleasant Park has been moving through secondary succession since Hurricane Juan removed most of the canopy. Right now, the forest sits in a mid-successional stage, which is exactly what we predicted. The red maple took over early because of the disturbance, opening up the canopy and creating highlight conditions that favor the fast-growing, disturbance-adapted hardwoods like the red maple. And our data shows a strong and significant increase in this red maple density over time. And simultaneously, the red spruce, which is a late successional shade-tolerant species, which is historically dominant in the Acadian forest, is beginning to reestablish. Its increase is slower, but statistically significant, which fits perfectly with its ecological role. This matches our hypothesis that the red maple's dominance is temporary and that the red spruce will gradually return as canopy closure increases. We also see that species richness and Shannon diversity continue to rise, while evenness declines slightly because of one species, mainly the red maple, which currently dominates. This pattern is typical in mid-successional systems, and it's expected to plateau or even decline as the forest approaches its climax community. And Point Pleasant Park is also an urban park, and this affects its successional theory. Human disturbance alters regeneration patterns. There's invasive species such as the Norway maple that compete with native seedlings, and debris removal that removes coarse woody material that is really important for nutrient cycling and forest structure. But despite all of these pressures, our hypothesis was supported. Point Pleasant Park is moving from mid towards late succession, and if the current trends continue, red spruce is expected to gradually replace the red maple in the canopy, guiding the forest back towards a mature Acadian community consistent with its pre-disturbance structure.
Another factor that could potentially impact Point Pleasant Park's succession is its coastal proximity. For example, several of the forest edges are exposed to the shore and salt water, making them susceptible to things like excess wind and salt spray, which negatively impacts vegetation growth and can prevent successional tree species from establishing. This could result in the exposed edges of the park favoring salt and wind-tolerant species and ultimately slow Point Pleasant Park's progression to a mature forest.
Okay, so we asked what would happen if there was another hurricane? What would that look like for the species that of Point Pleasant Park? And the species that already thrive in disturbance and highlight conditions would recover the fastest. So since the forest is still in a mid-successional stage, I think that many of the sun-loving ground flora that exploded right after the first hurricane, like grasses, sedges, the rubus species, bracken fern, and northern wild raisin, would likely dominate again right after a storm. For trees, we'd expect that red maple, white birch, and red oak to survive and rebound quickly because they already grow so well under open canopy conditions. And the red spruce would potentially survive, but mostly just through its seedlings and saplings, which are protected in the understory. Even though the larger individuals would be more vulnerable to the wind of a hurricane. And before Hurricane Juan, there were many big conifers in Point Pleasant Park, and because they tolerated such a range of conditions, they could also reappear in another major disturbance. But overall, the species best adapted to disturbance, both in the canopy and on the forest floor, are the ones that we would expect to dominate immediately after another hurricane. One of the questions we were tasked with is if we were to create a park management plan following Hurricane Juan, what would we do? Our answer is simple. We would limit the human activity. It could easily set back the growth rate due to how destructive we are by nature, be it accidentally trampling around ground cover or polluting the area. We know this is possible as well, as we had a ban on woodland activity over the summer. And there was some complaints, but overall, it's quite well.
Two-eyed seeing, or Amntu'kati, is a guiding principle that covers all aspects of our lives, including social, economic, and environmental, and is based on how you should live while you're on Earth and our responsibilities to preserve nature for future generations. This principle involves combining both indigenous knowledge and Western science in conservation and management efforts, and it can be used to effectively assist Point Pleasant Park's recovery by using the strengths of both. So, using two-eyed seeing alongside ecology encourages us to view the forest as a natural cycle of disturbance and regrowth, and not just something that we need to restore to a past state. Thanks.
We would like to acknowledge Allison Schmidt for designing this assignment and Joanna Ziggeries for facilitating the study, compiling and analyzing the data collected, and creating the graphs used within this presentation. We would also like to thank the Biology 2060 students over the years for collecting this data. An additional thank you to our TA, Steph, and to one another for this collaboration.